saw Woody Allen's movie The Front on cable last weekend. It's a good movie and does a great job of illuminating some of the weirdness that is American politics and culture. Because the movie is about events in the 1950s, we often relegate this in our mind to history. But the strange ways of thinking that the 1950s represent have not died, and in fact, just last month the FBI brought it all back. There's a story going around to the effect that Thurgood Marshall gave information to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI while Marshall was at the NAACP. Supposedly, Marshall gave the FBI information about NAACP members who were members of or otherwise associated with the Communist Party USA. I'm not concerned about whether this actually happened. Anyone who takes the FBI at face value is the worst kind of fool. What interests me is the public reaction, specifically media reaction to these supposed revelations. For example, one Denton Watson, writing for the New York Times, reminds us that in 1950, the NAACP voted to take necessary action to eradicate communists from the NAACP. And why? Because, quote, of the grave harm done by communists to the legitimate struggle of the Negro for civil rights, unquote. For those of you who don't take government propaganda seriously, this statement will seem bizarre. Too bizarre to be believed, but it's true. The NAACP, an organization founded and for many years run with the energy of communist activists, turned against its own founders and voted them out. Why would they do that? The Watson piece presents this information as if it's obvious to everyone. For some unstated reason, we are expected to believe that communists lobbying for justice in America is somehow harmful, not just to the legitimate struggle of the Negro for civil rights, but for all Americans. Communists have always been and always will be on the front lines of the struggle for civil rights for all people. In fact, the presence of communists in any political movement in America is a sign of its seriousness. The legitimate struggle for the rights of all people is the reason there are communists. Marx himself once wrote, "Labor in the white skin can never be free so long as labor in the black skin is enslaved." This is a truism of market economics. True regardless of your position on race relations. If any large segment of the working class is kept oppressed and underpaid, then this super-exploitation will have the effect of lowering wages across the board. So communists have always been in on the fight for the rights of all oppressed racial minorities, mostly out of principle, but partly out of self-interest. We often forget that the struggle for socialism is a self-motivated struggle. Justice for all means justice for me. Keep that in mind. But back to the interesting part. The Watson piece assumes that pushing communists out of the NAACP was in the best interests of the organization, and in fact necessary for its survival. Why? It's still strange to me how anti-communist ideas get such wide and unquestioned play in our society. It is perfectly irrational to suggest that an organization which exists for the sole purpose of pursuing civil rights for an oppressed minority would want to eliminate from its volunteers those people most committed to the very struggle for which the organization exists. That is fundamentally irrational. And yet Watson can present this line of thinking as if it's somehow obvious that justice is a threat to black people. And just who is Denton L. Watson anyway? He's a former public relations director for the NAACP, which must go a long way to explaining why the NAACP has been having such a hard time lately. They got rid of most of the people who had a clue about what was going on and how to construct the struggle. Mr. Watson is sold out. He's a columnist for the Times now, and black people are being systematically oppressed by a government that sells crack cocaine in their neighborhoods and keeps most able-bodied young African-American men in prison. But Watson probably doesn't mind because the NAACP has been formally free of communist influence, free of the influence of those deeply committed to justice. Communists are still in the NAACP, but let's keep that our little secret. And Watson is not alone. A lot of people from the 1950s onwards have sold out. In fact, the holding of anti-communist ideas is one of the best indicators that someone has sold out. Anyone who is serious about justice knows that the communists are the ones who will be there when the chips are down. And it is not just about socialism. A good many social activists working on justice issues aren't socialists, but they still know who they can count on. After all, it is the very pinnacle of stupidity to take ideological and strategic advice from your enemy, the corporate ruling class that is the enemy of all people interested in justice. Justice for women, for all people of color, for the environment, and for working people the world over. This is Richard Curtis. Veterans and Freedom.